The snow was already past my ankles when Constance Whitmore threw my coat at my feet like it was garbage she didn't want touching her porch. "Take your babies and get out." I bent down as fast as I could with Aloan against my chest, one arm still cradling her, and yanked the coat around my shoulders with my free hand, not even getting it fully on before Dalton pushed the door wider behind his mother. My boots, the ones I kept by the entryway for quick trips to the mailbox, were still there, and I shoved my feet into them half-laced, my hands too shaky and full of newborns to manage the rest. It wasn't enough. Not against a night that cold, not against wind that cut through a coat that wasn't zipped and boots that weren't tied. But it was more than nothing, and in that moment, more than nothing was all I had time to grab. Her voice cracked through the freezing air, sharp enough to wake the twins in my arms. Eloan started crying first, her tiny face scrunched red against the cold. Ezra followed a second later, his cry thinner, weaker. 10 days old and already learning that the world could turn on you without warning. I stood there on the frozen driveway of the house I had been living in for 2 years, holding 2 newborns against my chest, my coat hanging open over a thin nursing gown, boots half-laced and already filling with snow, watching my husband close the front door behind his mother without once looking back at me. Dalton didn't even flinch. That's the part that still sits wrong in my chest, all this time later. Not the cold, not Constance's screaming. It was watching the man I married stand in the doorway of our home, warm light spilling out behind him, and choose to let the door shut on his own children like we were something he'd already thrown away days ago. They thought I had nowhere else to go. They thought I was a struggling freelance designer barely covering rent, dependent on the Pierce family for every diaper, every meal, every breath of stability I had left. They had no idea who they were really standing in front of. And by the time this story ends, neither Dalton nor his mother will ever forget it. My name is Briar Callahan, and 10 days before that night in the snow, I gave birth to twins in a hospital room where my husband checked his phone 43 times during 11 hours of labor. I counted. When you're lying there gripping a rail with your body tearing itself open to bring 2 lives into the world, counting becomes the only thing that keeps your mind from splitting apart with the pain. 43 times. His screen lighting up his face while a nurse held my hand because he wasn't holding it. I told myself it was stress. New father nerves. I told myself a lot of things in those years because that's what you do when you've built your entire adult life around a story you need to be true. Here's the story I need you to understand first because none of what happened later makes sense without it. 3 years ago, I met Dalton Pierce at a charity gala in Chicago. I was there representing a boutique design firm. At least, that's what my business card said. What it didn't say was that the firm was mine. I had built it from nothing, starting with hand-drawn sketches sold out of a rented studio apartment when I was 24, growing it into a name that high-end residential clients whispered about in rooms I wasn't even in. I designed under a professional alias, Ren Ashford, a name I created back when I was terrified that if people knew a 20-something woman with no formal architecture degree was behind the work, they'd stop taking me seriously. The alias became a kind of armor. Nobody in Dalton's world had ever connected Briar Callahan, the quiet woman who showed up to family dinners in thrifted blazers, to Ren Ashford, the designer whose wait list stretched 18 months long. I never lied about my success. I simply never advertised it. There's a difference, even if the Pierce family would spend the next 3 years refusing to see it. Growing up, money had always been a source of quiet humiliation in my house. My mother cleaned offices at night and sewed alterations during the day to keep us afloat after my father left. And I remembered, with a clarity that never faded, the particular way certain relatives used to look at her secondhand coat, her worn shoes, the careful way she counted change at the grocery store. I promised myself young that I would build something so solid nobody could ever look at me that way again. I just never imagined that the version of success I built would end up being the very thing I hid from the man I married because some old wound in me still equated being loved with being wanted regardless of what I had. That wound is exactly what the Pierce family found and pressed on again and again, without ever knowing they were doing it. Dalton was charming that night. attentive in a way that felt like sunlight after years of cold client meetings and solitary work nights. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He made me laugh so hard at that gala that a caterer asked us to quiet down. I fell for him slowly, the way you fall into a warm bath without noticing the water rising past your shoulders. I didn't correct him when he assumed my modest wardrobe meant modest earnings. I didn't explain that the little design gig I mentioned casually was actually a company with 12 employees and contracts with clients whose homes had elevators. Some small, quiet part of me liked being loved without my success attached to it. I wanted to know if Dalton Pierce would have chosen me even if I had nothing. I got my answer. It just took 3 years and 2 newborns to arrive. Constance never liked me. That part was obvious from our very first dinner, when she looked at my department store dress and said, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "Well, Dalton certainly doesn't choose women for their bank accounts, does he?" I laughed it off then. I laugh a lot less about it now. Constance ran the Pierce family like a corporation with herself as permanent chairwoman. Dalton's late father had left behind a modest fortune and a struggling boutique hospitality business, 3 small and scattered across 2 states, that Constance had been trying to keep afloat for a decade through sheer stubbornness and a series of increasingly desperate loans. She adored appearances. She adored control. And she had decided within the first month of meeting me that I was a woman marrying up, a woman who needed to be managed, watched, and eventually removed once she'd served whatever purpose Constance imagined I served. I didn't fight her for a place in that family. I simply built my life quietly alongside theirs, working from a converted sunroom in the house Dalton and I bought together. A house that, on paper, was listed under both our names, but that I had contributed nearly 70% of the down payment toward, using savings I never disclosed the source of. Dalton knew I had some money saved. He never asked how much. I never told him. Looking back, that silence wasn't intimacy. It was 2 people building a marriage on separate, unshared truths, and truths that go unshared long enough eventually curdle into something else entirely. The pregnancy was hard. Twins are hard on any body, and mine fought me through all 36 weeks I carried them. Dalton grew distant almost the moment the second line appeared on the test. I told myself it was fear. New fatherhood terrifies a lot of men. I made excuses for the late nights at the office, for the phone he started keeping face down on every surface, for the way he stopped reaching for me in bed months before I ever got too big to be held. There were smaller signs, too, the kind you only recognize clearly once you're forced to look back at them under a harsher light. Dalton stopped asking how the baby names were coming along somewhere around month 5. He stopped putting his hand on my stomach at night, feeling for a kick, laughing softly when he found one. He started coming home later, always with a reasonable explanation. A client dinner, a deadline, a colleague's send-off party. I believed everyone, because believing him was easier than sitting with the alternative. I should have paid closer attention to a woman named Sabrina Voss. Sabrina worked at Dalton's firm, a marketing associate with a laugh that carried across open-plan offices and a habit of just checking in with my husband on weekends when I was elbow-deep in nursery paint and 3rd trimester exhaustion. I met her twice at company events. Both times, Dalton introduced her the same overly casual way. "This is Sabrina. She's on my team." The kind of introduction a man gives when he's rehearsed how casual it needs to sound. I didn't know yet. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where I was some brilliant detective piecing together clues from the beginning. I was a very pregnant, very tired woman trying to build a nursery and keep a company running from a laptop balanced on my swollen knees. I missed things. Or maybe some part of me chose not to look too closely, the way you avoid touching a bruise because you already know how much it will hurt. The twins came 3 days early, in the middle of a Tuesday snowstorm, 11 hours of labor that left me hollowed out and stitched together and holding 2 impossibly small humans who were, for one exhausted, tear-soaked moment, the only thing that mattered in the entire world. Ezra came first, quiet and watchful even as a newborn. Eloan followed 4 minutes later, already furious at the cold hospital air, her cry filling the room in a way that made a nurse laugh and say she'd be running the household by age 3. Dalton held them both. He cried, actually cried, and for a moment I let myself believe that whatever distance had grown between us over the pregnancy would close now that our children were here, breathing, real ours. I was wrong. It closed for exactly 10 days. 10 days is not very long. It's barely enough time for a newborn's umbilical stump to fall away, barely enough time for a mother's body to remember how to function on interrupted sleep, barely enough time to establish anything resembling a rhythm with two infants who needed to be fed every 2 hours around the clock. It was, apparently, exactly enough time for Dalton and his mother to finish planning what came next. I noticed a shift on day 7. Constance started arriving at the house daily, always with some excuse, bringing soup, checking on her grandbabies, lingering in the kitchen with Dalton in hushed conversations that stopped the second I walked in. I chalked it up to grandmother enthusiasm mixed with new parent exhaustion, making everything feel more suspicious than it was. On day 9, I found a text on the shared family tablet we kept for grocery lists, a message from Sabrina to Dalton that had synced across devices by some careless setting neither of us had thought to check. It wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. Almost there. Once she's out, we can finally stop hiding this. I read it standing in the nursery at 4 a.m., Eloan asleep against my shoulder, my whole body suddenly colder than the room actually was. Once she's out. Out of what? I didn't yet fully understand. I assumed, in my sleep-deprived panic, that it meant out of the marriage. I had no idea, not yet, how literal that phrase was about to become. I confronted Dalton the next morning, quietly, exhausted, holding Ezra while he fed from a bottle because my body had nothing left to give at that point. I asked him directly who Sabrina was to him. He didn't deny it the way a guilty but repentant man might. He didn't crumble or beg forgiveness. He looked at me with something close to relief, like I'd finally said out loud what he'd been too much of a coward to say himself. "This isn't working, Briar," he said. "It hasn't for a long time. I think it's better if we're honest about that now, before things get more complicated." More complicated. As if 2 10-day-old infants weren't already the most complicated, precious thing either of us would ever be responsible for. I want to tell you I fought back in that moment with fire and fury, but the truth is I sat there in stunned silence, holding our son, while my husband explained in a calm, rehearsed voice that he and Sabrina had been involved for the better part of a year, that he'd been planning to tell me once things settled, and that his mother agreed it would be best for everyone if I took some time to figure things out somewhere else. Somewhere else. As though I had a somewhere else lined up. As though a woman 10 days postpartum with 2 newborns simply had a backup home waiting in the wings. They assumed I didn't. That was their first mistake. Constance arrived at 6 that evening, ostensibly to help with the babies, though I understood by then that her visits had never really been about the twins. She swept through the front door with the particular energy of a woman who had been waiting for this moment. "We need to talk, Briar," she said, settling onto the couch like she owned the house, which, to be fair to her assumptions, she believed she practically did, since she'd never once considered that anyone but Dalton could have paid for it. This arrangement clearly isn't sustainable. I asked what arrangement she meant, though I already knew. "You and Dalton," she said, waving a hand as though the marriage itself was an inconvenient piece of furniture. "It's not working. Everyone can see that. And frankly, dear, it would be better for the children to have stability now rather than growing up in a house full of tension." I held Eloan a little tighter and asked, very simply, where exactly she thought I was supposed to take that stability, since I had no family in the state, no immediate income she was aware of, and 2 infants who needed round-the-clock care. Constance smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "You'll figure something out. You always do, don't you? Working from that little sunroom of yours." The way she said little made my skin crawl. "You've clearly gotten by before Dalton. I'm sure you'll manage." I looked at Dalton, standing near the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing, not defending me, not defending our children's right to a stable home their mother had built with her own money, just standing there, letting his mother do the work of ending my marriage for him, the same way he let a nurse hold my hand during labor while he checked his phone. That was the moment I understood something had shifted permanently between all three of us. And it kept shifting, fast, over the next several hours, until it reached a point none of us could take back. It happened just before 9 that night. I had gone upstairs to feed the twins, exhausted past the point of coherent thought, when I heard raised voices below, Constance's clipped, furious tone cutting through the floorboards, Dalton's lower voice occasionally trying and failing to interrupt her. When I came back down with Ezra finally asleep against my chest and Aloan fussing in my other arm, Constance was standing by the front door holding my coat, my hospital discharge bag, and a stack of baby items she had apparently packed herself while I was upstairs. "I think it's best you go stay somewhere tonight," she said. "Clear your head. Let Dalton and I sort out the practical details." I told her I wasn't leaving my home at 9 at night with 2 newborns in the middle of a snowstorm. That's when her voice broke into the scream that started this whole story. "Take your babies and get out." I looked at Dalton. I actually looked directly at him, waiting, genuinely waiting, some small foolish part of me still hoping for him to step forward and tell his mother to stop, to tell me to sit down, to acknowledge that whatever had broken between us didn't mean our children deserved to be thrown into a snowstorm. He didn't move. He looked at the floor, and then he opened the front door himself. I don't remember deciding to walk through it. I remember the cold hitting my face first, sharper than anything I'd felt in years, and then the sound of the door closing behind me, the click of the lock turning, the warm light disappearing behind frosted glass while I stood on a driveway holding 2 crying infants, my unzipped coat doing little against wind that found every gap in it. For a few seconds, I couldn't move at all. My body was still recovering from labor, every stitch inside me screaming with the effort of simply standing upright, and the wind cut through the thin cotton of my gown like it had personal business with my bones. Aloan's cry rose into something raw and frantic, and I remember pressing my lips to the top of her head, whispering the only thing I could think to say, over and over, half to her and half to myself. "We're okay. We're okay. We're okay." I didn't believe it yet. I said it anyway, because a newborn can't hear despair and a mother can't afford to let it show, even when despair is the only honest thing in her chest. I looked back once at the house, at the porch light glowing gold against the snow, at the shape of Dalton's shadow retreating from the window, and something inside me went very quiet and very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes solid. I remember thinking, with a strange, distant clarity that only comes in moments of true shock, they think this is the end of something for me. They had absolutely no idea it was the beginning. I didn't call a shelter that night. I didn't call a friend to come rescue me, sobbing on their doorstep. I did something Constance and Dalton never once imagined I was capable of because they had spent 3 years deciding I was a woman with nothing behind her name. I called my company's emergency driver line, the car service my own firm retained for late client meetings, and within 11 minutes, a black SUV pulled into that driveway. My assistant, Marisol, had a room at a hotel booked and heated bottles ready by the time I arrived because I had texted her the second I stepped off that porch, and Marisol didn't ask a single question before she started making calls. I want to be very clear about something here. I was never broke. I was never without options. I had simply spent 3 years choosing not to reveal the full truth of who I was and what I had built, because I wanted a marriage where I wasn't valued for a bank balance. That choice had cost me the ability to be seen clearly by the 2 people who were about to learn exactly who they had thrown into the snow. By midnight, wrapped in a hotel robe with both twins, finally settled, and sleeping in a hospital-grade bassinet, my company kept on standby for exactly this kind of emergency travel need. I opened my laptop and did the one thing I had avoided doing for 3 years. I told the truth. The first call went to my lawyer, a sharp, unflappable woman named Priya Okafor who had handled my company's contracts since the beginning. I explained everything, the house, the down payment records under my real name, the marriage, the affair, the scream in the snow. Priya listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I'll never forget. "Briar, you own 70% equity in that house through documented transfers. You have 3 years of bank statements proving independent income exceeding anything Dalton has ever earned. And you have a text message admitting to premeditated infidelity timed around your childbirth. This isn't complicated. This is going to be very, very clean. The second call went to my company's PR director, a young, ferociously loyal woman named Odessa Marsh, who had been begging me for 2 years to let the industry know that Ren Ashford and Briar Callahan were the same person. "It's a story, Briar," she'd said more than once. "A good one. People love finding out the quiet woman in the corner is actually the one running the room." That night, for the first time, I told her to run it. Not out of spite. I want to be honest about my own motivations here, because revenge stories are more satisfying when they're rooted in something real. I wasn't doing this to destroy Dalton for the sake of destruction. I was doing it because I finally understood that hiding my success had never protected my marriage. It had only protected Dalton and Constance's ability to underestimate me, and underestimation, I was learning fast, is a very dangerous thing to hand people who already think poorly of you. There was a practical side to going public too, one I didn't fully appreciate until Odessa raised it. Any firm my size runs a standing conflict of interest review whenever a founder's name becomes public in connection with legal or reputational trouble. It's routine risk management, the same review we'd run if a client turned out to be under federal investigation. Odessa's team pulled the active contract list within the week, cross-referencing every client against the Pierce name out of standard caution, nothing more. That's how we found it. Constance's business manager had signed with my firm nearly a year earlier through a referral from another hospitality client we'd worked with, a fairly ordinary way for contracts to land in a luxury design market that's smaller and more interconnected than people assume. Nobody on my end had made the connection before then, because I never reviewed client rosters personally at that scale, and Constance's manager had signed the deal without her ever once asking who was actually behind the firm's name. The following weeks moved with a kind of momentum I hadn't expected. Odessa's carefully placed feature ran in a design industry publication with wide reach. The quiet, publicity-shy founder behind some of the most sought-after residential interiors on the East Coast had a name, and a face, and a story about surviving a winter night that involved being locked out of her own home. The piece didn't name Dalton or Constance directly, but it didn't need to. Anyone in their social circle who read it understood exactly who the estranged husband and controlling mother-in-law, mentioned in careful, lawyer-approved language actually were. Priya moved quickly on the legal front, though quickly, in family court still meant weeks, not days. Within 4 days, she secured an emergency temporary order granting me exclusive use of the home. Courts move fast when infants are involved and a parent has documentation showing they were removed from a residence without safety or care arranged, but an emergency order is not a final ruling. It bought me the house and the twin stability while the actual case unfolded, which took the better part of 2 months of filings, financial disclosures, and one deposition where Dalton's own words from that night were read back to him by Priya, slowly twice. Because the house deed reflected my documented financial contribution far more heavily than Dalton's, and because Illinois courts take a firm view on primary caregivers of infants being unlawfully removed from a shared residence, the temporary order held through the full proceedings and eventually became permanent. Dalton fought it, briefly, with the kind of energy men display when they've never once had to fight for anything in their lives and don't know how to sustain it. His lawyer argued the house was marital property. Priya calmly produced 3 years of wire transfer records showing my independent contribution, alongside a forensic accountant's report showing that during the same period, Dalton's contributions to household expenses had steadily declined while unexplained withdrawals, later traced to a rented apartment leased under Sabrina Voss's name, had steadily increased. The affair, once merely implied, surfaced gradually through those same financial filings over the following weeks, first in the accountant's report, then in Sabrina's own deposition, until it existed in the case record whether anyone wanted it there or not. Constance's reaction to all of this deserves its own mention because it tells you everything about who she really was underneath the polished appearances she'd spent a decade curating. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften. Instead, she attempted to rally what remained of the family's social circle against me, telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated my way into their family, that I had hidden my wealth like some kind of con artist working an angle. She miscalculated badly, because by then, the story circulating wasn't about a con artist. It was about a mother pushed into the snow with newborn twins by a husband's mistress-fueled betrayal and a mother-in-law's cruelty, and design clients, as it turns out, care deeply about the character of the person redesigning their million-dollar homes. 3 of Constance's own hospitality properties, the variants she'd spent a decade struggling to keep solvent, had recently signed contracts with my firm for a planned renovation meant to save the failing business, the same contract Odessa's team had flagged during their routine review. I let my legal team quietly and professionally exercise the contract's standard morality clause the week the affair became part of the public case record. The renovation contracts were terminated. Constance's ins, already drowning in debt, lost the exact financial lifeline that project represented. I didn't gloat. I didn't send a single message. I simply let the paperwork speak, the way she had once let a slammed door speak for her. None of this came without cost to me, and I think it's important to say that plainly rather than let this sound like a clean victory lap. Some of Dalton's extended family sided with him publicly, calling me calculating for going public at all, saying I'd weaponized my success against a man simply trying to move on. A handful of prospective clients quietly backed away from working with a designer now tangled up in a messy, publicized divorce, worried about their own privacy by association. Legal fees ran high enough that I dipped into savings I'd built for years without touching. And there were nights, plenty of them, when I sat awake with a crying infant on each side of me and felt nothing like a woman winning anything, just a woman surviving one more exhausting hour of a fight she never asked to be in. The custody arrangement, when it finally settled after those months of filings, gave me primary residence with the twins. Dalton's visitation started fully supervised, standard, Priya explained. Whenever a court sees this much instability and this little established routine between a father and infants in the earliest weeks of their lives, regardless of fault, it wasn't designed as punishment, though it certainly felt like consequence. Over the following year, as Dalton showed up consistently and completed the parenting classes the court required, the supervision requirement gradually lifted. I won't pretend that didn't complicate the clean, satisfying ending I might have wanted. Co-parenting with a man who broke your family apart is its own particular kind of exhausting, one that doesn't end just because the court case does. I moved back into the house in early spring, the same driveway where I had once stood freezing with 2 newborns, now edged with the first stubborn crocuses, pushing up through the last of the snow. I stood there for a long moment on the day I got the keys back, Ezra strapped to my chest, Iloa napping in her stroller, and I let myself finally fully cry, not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief. Dalton reached out eventually, months later, in a message that read more like a man mourning what he'd lost than a man who understood why he'd lost it. He wrote that he never expected things to go this far. He wrote that he didn't realize how much he'd taken for granted. I didn't respond with anger. I responded with 4 words that felt more true than anything I could have shouted at him on that porch. You had every warning. He tried once more, weeks after that, showing up unannounced outside the office where I now worked openly under my own name, no alias left to hide behind. He stood there in the parking lot looking smaller than I remembered him ever being, and he asked, quietly, why I never told him the truth about who I was from the very beginning. I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered, because it deserved an honest response rather than a cutting one. I told you exactly who I was, Dalton, I said. You just decided a woman without much money was easier to love than a woman who didn't need you to survive. That was never my secret to carry. That was yours. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think he ever will. Sabrina and Dalton's relationship, from what I understand through the small, unavoidable overlap our lives still share because of the twins, didn't survive the fallout either. It's a strange thing, watching a relationship built on secrecy discover that secrecy doesn't disappear once it's served its purpose. It simply gets redirected toward whoever's convenient to blame next. Constance never apologized. I've stopped waiting for her to. Some people are constitutionally incapable of admitting the driveway they built with their own hands was the one